Hello and welcome back to our chapter lectures on humanism in the 21st century. Today we'll be addressing chapter 9, The Nation, which in many ways is a continuation of our previous discussion on the topic of culture, the last four of our big four categories of sociological identity. And when we turn to the nation, what we're going to start to look at is the way that cultures aggregate into large groups, and those large group formations then become the concept of the nation. Right off the bat, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind as we discuss this chapter is that the concept of the nation is new, historically speaking. So we're covering 2,500 years of history, philosophy, and culture in this class, and I should add from a specifically Western point of view. And when we talk about the nation, we're talking about an idea that really is only 300 years old, and a phenomenon, a sociological phenomenon that we can actually look at and study that is really only about 220 years old. So relatively speaking, it's a baby. In terms of forms of government, it's really young. In terms of forms of social organization, it's even younger than that. But today, for us, the concept of the nation is normal. It's one of the things that we've come to accept. And there is a Platonic basis for the concept of the nation. It's an idea that's supposed to embody the essence of a group of people. Right? So we do have that strongly, but one of the things to recognize is that just like so many of the Platonic notions of identity that we've been looking at, it starts to break down in the early 20th century. And here we had two signal events. One was modernism, with which we finished the previous lecture. We talked about the cultural upheaval of those concepts. Modernism, in many ways, was against nationhood as a form of identity. It was an international movement. It did not think that the notions of nationalism were actually productive culturally for that group of people at that time. And a big reason for that is that they were able to witness the horrors of World War I. And when we call it World War I, we're already being teleological in the Platonic sense, because, of course, when World War I happened, nobody thought that this terrible event was going to be repeated. So the real name of that war was the Great War. Great there not meaning good or wonderful, but terrific and large. So terrific in the original sense, of course, is terrifying, right? So the concept of the nation here in a lot of ways started to shift with World War I. And that was because the technologies of modern industrial capitalism and the cultural shifts that were going on with new communications technologies were driving a new form of war that had never been seen before. In previous wars, we think of the people who go off and fight as heroes or heroic in some ways. And in many ways, our rhetoric still today mirrors or mimics that phenomenon, right? The idea that the person who goes away and risks their lives can be heroic or brave in some way, can stand up to insurmountable odds, can overcome them nonetheless through that heroism. These are ideals that we still hold on to and are very important for us. But in World War I, or the Great War, it really took an amazing hit because we started to shift our very notion of what a hero is. Up until that point, we had imagined that somebody could be almost invincible in some way. Right? Think about the way we heroize ancient figures like Achilles or someone like that. Right? To truly be a hero, in some ways, doesn't imagine a vulnerable body or a body that can be penetrated by metal, either in the form of bullets or weapons, and somebody psychologically who never breaks down under that terrible pressure. Well, World War I actually created conditions under which you could no longer be a hero. Right? I think about all the different weapons that were introduced for the first time in World War I. The machine gun, the real machine gun. There was an earlier form called the Gatling gun in the Civil War, but this truly was much more devastating. The first tanks, barbed wire, poison gas, which is now outlawed by the Geneva Convention precisely because in World War I we saw how many tens of thousands of people could die. The trench mortar. So mortar is basically a grenade that's lobbed, and the reason that was invented was to try to continue to kill soldiers who were hiding in trenches. Well, why were they hiding in trenches? That was also a new form of warfare where the battlefield became simply so dangerous that no human being could possibly stand up and survive. And under those conditions, the idea of the hero gave way to what we started to understand as the soft human body, right? The body that is no longer like steel, but rather we've met our match in these new technological elements. And in some ways, the technology was what won that war, not humans. When all the nations after World War I looked around and saw the incredible devastation, they also noticed that something new had happened. Not only was the physical body fragmented and mutilated, but also the psyches of the people who came back from war, even if they were relatively unscathed, they were damaged. And nobody had seen that before. And so we developed a new word for it with the new field of psychoanalysis. We developed the word shell shock, which actually literally comes from the shells, the mortars that are lobbed. And the shock there, the concept of shock, is the notion that something so dramatic has happened to your system that you simply cannot recover from it ever again. Today, we have a more modern and more sophisticated way of talking about this as PTSD, but shell shock was probably one of the earliest explorations of that psychological condition of warfare. Now, sad to say, it's quite normal and it's something that we all know about, but it started with the 20th century and the mechanization of war that also changed our entire concept of who the heroic individual is. No longer the isolated subject doing things by his or her own will, but rather somebody who's hiding, cowering in a trench, trying to survive from day to day. So not the honor or the heroism that perhaps we originally imagined, right? To think about this concept of the hero in relation to the techniques of self that we've discussed already in this class, discipline, identity, and values that are so important to becoming a soldier, those are at least challenged, if not completely obliterated, by an event like the First World War, in which shell shocks created the fragmented and mutilated psyche, as well as the war injuries creating fragmented and mutilated bodies. When tens of thousands of young men came back from World War I and tried to resume their normal life, they had found that everything had changed for them, right? So they had changed, and the war had made a difference in the way that they saw the world and understood it, and that was something that actually caused a lot of social tension right after that period. If we think about the way that the propaganda works during a war, just like when we looked in the last chapter at the Greeks and the way that they created the term barbarians to think about the Persians, the people from the East, right? We also, when we go into war today, create an other with a capital O. People who are dehumanized for us and become the absolute bloodthirsty enemy whom we must destroy or be destroyed ourselves. And that serves national purposes. It perhaps is extremely important to what it takes to engage in war in the first place. But if you look at a poster like this one from World War I, what you see actually is a set of principles that participate in the binaries that we've been looking at all along in this class. This poster says, "Destroy this mad brute, enlist." And it's for American soldiers, encouraging them to join World War I, go across the pond, the Atlantic, fight and perhaps die, perhaps gloriously, perhaps not, in Europe somewhere. The United States came late to World War I, just as we came late to World War II. So this poster is 1917, very late into the war, which started actually in 1914. And at that time, 1914, the forces of Prussia, which now we call Germany, actually were the main ones that the United States felt antagonistic towards. And here we have a depiction of a kind of ape or orangutan-like creature. It's kind of a mix between different types of simian creature. So humanoid, but dehumanized, right? And we know that there's a racial tinge there too, that the concept of dehumanizing somebody specifically goes back to these notions of race. But these Germans, right, were a lot of them had come to the United States, become assimilated into American culture. So there was a feeling by a lot of Americans that there was a close association between German culture and the culture developing in the United States. However, with World War I, there was a complete break there, right? And so this creature here is actually wearing what's called a pith helmet. The helmet at the top with the little spike was specifically worn by German soldiers And what this poster is suggesting is that if young Americans don't go across the Atlantic and fight, then the Germans will come and take their women here, right? So let's look about not at the concept of race now, but at the concept of gender that's at play in the structure. How is this woman being depicted, right? Is she active or is she passive? And you can see here that she has a bared chest, and so actually there's two things going on at the structure of gender, where on the one hand there's the suggestion of rape on the part of this mad brute. Well, on the other hand, there's something titillating for the young male soldiers to see as well. So desire is working in somewhat of a two-faced way in this manner, right? Both we want to save our women, and here's something nice to look at that captures my attention as a young male recruit, and now I'm going to look at this poster a little bit longer. So this kind of soft pornographic element is also going on. If we look at the weapon that the mad brute is carrying, also notice something very interesting is said there. It has blood and gore all over it. So definitely, without a doubt, this is an instrument of violence. But it actually says culture there, and it's spelled in the German way, Kultur. And what it's suggesting is that there's a cultural imperialism going on the part of Germany, as well as a military imperialism. In other words, we don't want our America, which is written down below that word culture here on the sand, where the mad brute is arriving. We don't want our American culture being taken over by this German culture. So just in this one poster, we see the concepts of gender and sexuality, race and culture all being referenced at the same time. Really an extraordinary display of the way that binaries can all align very specifically during wartime. Normally here we have some group discussion to get to these points. It's a very interesting idea, though, to talk through this instead, because normally as we discover all of this, we start to really see how these binaries align. The city in the background, by the way, if you're curious, and we know this because this looks like a bombed out image of St. Paul's, that would be London, right? So if England were to be taken, then the idea is that America would be next. Okay. So this image should look familiar to you. When we talk in class at this point, one of the things we do is to look up some terms to discuss the key concepts that are at play in something like that poster that we just saw. And we have to introduce another binary, which is the ethnic concept. And ethnicity is considered today close to race, or rather it's something of a stand-in, but that's not accurate, right? So go ahead and take a moment here and look up the phrase dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which originally was a phrase by the poet Horace. And what happened was it was taken up again in the early 20th century by another poet who took the same words from Horace, but here in this case was actually using them ironically, right? So look up the term, figure out what it means, and then think about how it might be both used sincerely for somebody who really believes in this statement, and then look it up also in terms of, or think about it also in terms of the ironic use that you might put this to, right? And then again, if we look up the word patriotism, what we see is that the root word of patriotism is pater. So there's that word father, which relates closely to a certain concept that we inherit from Roman culture, which is the notion that the father is the center of the household, and also the representative of the leader is also a father figure for us, right? There's I think a really understandable reason why we haven't had, for example, a female president in the United States. It's because by and large, from the very beginning and written into our language, we have the concept of patriotism, or the fatherland, as really an inbuilt assumption, not just about gender and the way that it works, but also as it applies to culture and then nationalism. Okay, so turning to the term ethnos, if you look that up, you'll find that it's actually a mess. The term means everything and nothing. It sort of means a group of people who relate to each other, but how and why doesn't actually mean anything. It's a Greek word, and the Greeks used it to mean basically groups of people who could be identified, but that was actually a mobile identity. For us now, when we use ethnicity, we tend to imagine that it's somewhat fixed, or at least structurally consistent in some specific way. But just as we played this game last class, let's briefly play this game here. If you have an ethnicity, what does it consist in, right? Do you have cultural values? If everybody in that culture doesn't share those cultural values, are they still part of that ethnicity? And if it's not that, if it's something genetic or something about the way that people look or the clothing that they wear, the way they act or the things that they like, or some combination of those, why is it that there's so many people who, in a technical way, actually don't fit in to that image of the ethnos, right? So when we think about the concept of ethnoi, groups of people who are ethnically divided, in many ways it's an idea, a Platonic idea of difference rather than a notion of actual sameness that we can investigate. When we have conflicts between different ethnic groups, they see themselves as binarily opposed to that other group, even though they're actually fairly close. For example, one of my friends who takes frequent trips to Israel and identifies as Jewish. She's a Jewish conservative, is called, which means that she eats kosher. And kosher means that you have a lot of laws about what you can eat and what you can't eat, and it's an important part of ethnic Jewish identity. However, ironically, when she goes into Palestine, she knows that if there's a restaurant that is haram, which is the Islamic concept for the food and dietary restrictions that make up their ethnic identity, she knows that in fact, for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing as kosher, so she can eat there. And yet if you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the areas that hold these supposedly different ethnic groups, not only do they look similarly, not only do they share a lot of cultural heritage, but their food is actually identical, right? So this notion that these ethnic differences are somehow binary actually falls apart as soon as you take a closer look. Now, that's not to say that the feeling of ethnic difference is not significant and really important for different people. Just as with gender or sexuality or race or concepts of class, I would never argue that somebody's experience of subjectivity is trivial, because when we build these structures of ourselves, it is what we have to rely on. It's much more important, however, that we realize that these contradictions remind us consistently that we are not in a Platonic framework with identity. We are culturally constructing that identity, and it's changing over time, and that's why we can locate those differences that contradict the binary oppositions that we've been looking at. So when I ask how we distinguish among ethnic groups, you see this is actually a complex question, not a simple one. This creates problems for us. It does not heal those binary divisions. Think about that painting that we looked at from last class so much, the oath of the Horatii, in which the Horatii are going to go and kill the Koratii. And in fact, that is how the story ends, is these brothers end up winning and the Koratii die. But even in this painting itself, which imagines this very binary scene, what's important to remember is that these two families are actually intermixed. Right? They're not binarily separated. For example, this Horatii is married to a young Koratii woman, all right? And vice versa, one of the Horatii women is married to one of the Koratii. So the reason that this is so important, right, so dramatically important, is that we realize that the sacrifice for the nation means overcoming those actual, real interconnections, right? Or to take an example from closer to home, during the American Civil War, one of the things that was truly terrible about it for families that lived through that experience is that oftentimes they had family members and relatives who were fighting on both sides of the Civil War. Now, there was supposed to be a moment of binary division in our country, and yet you had people who were sacrificing on either side at the behest of this binary while not actually emotionally feeling that real level of separation. That's because we don't live in the binary, do we? We never actually live in Plato land. We live in this complex, mixed up, hybridized world in which our experiences never fully align with one specific form of identity. But we try our best. We try our best, and one of the ways that we do that is the concept of assimilation, which is, again, another modern notion, very much within the framework of the 20th century. Perhaps you've heard the phrase the melting pot. It's commonly in English parlance now, but it actually was introduced as a notion of assimilation by a playwright named Israel Zangwill in the early 20th century, and it was immensely influential. This play ran for a long time. In fact, Zangwill had his picture on the front of Time magazine. He was so famous after writing this and so influential as a cultural theorist of the concept. So what does it actually mean to assimilate? This is a term that we use casually quite a bit, but it actually has a really dramatic meaning. If your parents or you experience this process of assimilation, then actually you're probably very aware that there's real cultural pain involved in this experience. It means not only taking on new cultural attributes when you move to a new country and start to assimilate in that way, but also it means losing certain things that were part of another identity from another place. So there is oftentimes a tremendous amount of pain there. And sometimes in the United States, we treat immigration as though it's a fairly casual experience. It's something that people simply choose to do. But in fact, I would argue, at least for the vast majority of people, it actually is a very scary, painful, and difficult process. Just think about it for yourself. If you had to suddenly uproot for reasons that you did not choose and move to another country and try to start over, learn another language, learn another way of life, it would actually be really difficult, wouldn't it? And you'd probably feel a certain sense of loss of that notion of self that you rely on so much at the cultural level. So assimilation here actually is, I think, honestly depicted. Look at this, the poster, which became the frontispiece for this play, The Melting Pot. Look at all these people here. They're flowing in from all over the world, and they're coming into what is a melting pot. So if we think about this concept, a melting pot, take a closer look. The melting pot is actually a term from metal smelting. And what it means is that you take all kinds of different metals and you put them into something, you heat it up very, very hot. And by doing that, the impurities, the dross so-called, float up to the top, and then somebody's there with a basket to scoop away those impurities and throw them away. So think about this in human terms, right? You're brought into a country, you're melted down, broken down, brought into this condition in which you are able to assimilate and act like an American. And again, whether or not we know exactly what that means has to be put in parenthesis for the moment. But the things that don't fit into the culture, the differences that don't work, those are the things like dross that float up to the top that have to be scooped away. So even though The Melting Pot as a play is very hopeful at the possibilities of assimilation, it also is talking about a very painful and difficult process and experience. It's a metaphor that actually expresses some of those human conditions that we live through. And when we melt down and we get rid of all the differences that we don't want to have anymore culturally through this process of assimilation, what we're left with are cultural norms. All right, we're going to come back to this concept of cultural norms. We'll give it a more theoretical turn later on in this lecture. But for now, I want you to really think about that process of assimilation, right? Leaving behind a country, coming into another one. What do you lose? What is it that you have to change about yourself to really become an American citizen? Is it nothing? Is it very little? Is it some? Is it a tremendous amount? That will probably vary from person to person, but we know that this metaphor actually speaks to at least the potential for that tremendous pain and cultural loss. The notion of the nation came under serious scrutiny in the 20th century because of these changes, right? We saw World War I and the advent of technology. We had art communities like the modernists challenging these notions. And in a lot of ways, we started to move away from the assumption that borders actually created a space in which people were identical to each other. And in fact, probably the most successful challenge to this was launched by a wonderful theorist named Benedict Anderson in his book, Imagined Communities. And he actually walks us through a lot of the questions that we've been looking at. What is a nation, right? Is it a group of people who live in a specific place? Right. Well, the problem is here with that idea that the borders of nations change all the time. We tend to think of them as stable. If you know anything about American history, you know our borders, of course, have changed, but we are a modern nation that's been growing. What about Europe? It should have much more stable borders, right? Well, in fact, if you watch the video that I have provided here, what you'll see in Europe is that the borders of these spaces have changed beyond recognition over and over and over again because of war, because of plague, because of cultural developments. It doesn't really matter. That borders are these very fluid things, and we tend to imagine them as stationary and situating the real relationships among nations, but in fact they are permeable spaces that at best are makeshift at various times, right? Those people who are supposed to be living in the borders, do they all need to look the same and act the same? Well, some people have argued, in fact, that the answer to that is yes, at least traditionally. So in Europe, you expect, French people to act and look French. In Germany, they're supposed to act and look German. We're not actually sure what that means. And in the United States, we actually have a very loose sense of this precisely because of the makeup of our nation, right? We are a nation of immigrants. And as I discussed in the chapter on race, one of the things that's interesting about that is that we've even redefined the core categories of race through time. What does it mean to be white? Who from Europe can be considered European? Whether or not different people, such as people from Mexico, can be considered white, or whether they can be assimilated into American culture has been a long-standing question in the 20th century. Not just recently. So the idea that a group of people are supposed to be homogenous actually seems not to work very well either. And now in Europe, the heterogeneity of the population is becoming more evident, and that is causing cultural conflict. And yet here we have a situation in which people are starting to act and look a lot more like the United States around the world, more cultural assimilation, more diversity, more complex cultural interactions. So given the fact that Anderson rejects these two cornerstone notions, that it's the borders of the people inside of those borders who make up a nation, he then turns to provide his own answer. And what he suggests, in fact, is very close to the term homo neurons that we introduced earlier when we were talking about key forms of identity. He suggests that we imagine a community, and we don't just imagine it out of thin air, we recreate it on a daily basis. And how do we do that? Through our media, right? The things that allow us to communicate with each other, and by those communication technologies, we create narratives together about what it means to be a nation. Think about being aware of the news, right? So in your, say, Facebook feed, if you have one, or whatever it is that you use every day to get your information, that information technology feeds you stories from other people and makes you feel connected to those people. If you didn't have those, then your imagination of them would not be so tightly built around the notion of connection, would it? Right? So, for example, I very rarely speak to some of my cousins. I don't think about them very much. I like them, but the fact that I don't know their stories and what's going on with them all the time makes me think about them a little bit less. On the other hand, the family that I have living immediately in this area, they're people whose stories I'm a little bit more aware of. So events that happen in their lives now are things that through information technologies I'm more easily able to get a hold of. Well, this is not just true on an interpersonal level, but on a national level. We tell a national story through things like at least traditionally, are newspapers, right? And it's not an accident that the notion of nationhood is really born with the modern press, the printing press becoming sophisticated enough through movable type and eventually through printing to allow us to share news and information constantly. And it's very interesting to notice that the United States was born with that concept of the news. We've loved news from the beginning. We've shared news. Newspapers have abounded in the United States more so than most nations, and the way that we've used them is to share that information. So if Benedict Anderson is right here, that we create these stories by sharing through these information technologies, then the fact that we have new information technologies now, born since the 1990s, so just one generation fully now, is really significant, isn't it? The way that we communicate changes the stories that we tell, and the fact that we've just radically shifted how we communicate means that our narratives are restructuring too. Perhaps you've noticed some of this feeling of instability. We are not sure whether or not we want newspapers anymore, right? They give us much less information than they used to. We're also a little bit more skeptical of experts and the centralization of cultural authority than we used to be, right? Who are the real authors of our story? Well, you might say right now that we're in a bit of a tussle over that concept, right? We're not really sure who should be telling the story, and in fact, in many ways, we're having disagreements precisely because this new information technology has destabilized some of those frameworks of cultural dominance and authority that normally we rely on. So we're being de-binarized and a little bit deconstructed specifically in that way through our new information technologies, and that's changing the way that we conceptualize ourselves through Homo neurons. Are we still a nation? Are we an interconnected global community? To what degree are we regional versus national? Right? These are questions that we're constantly asking and answering through these imagined communities, but now we're having to imagine them in a new way. And I would suggest that the proper metaphor for really thinking about this is no longer information technologies per se, but a network structure, right? Because a network doesn't have to just include information technologies. It can, and of course it really does quite a bit, but you also have social relationships with other people concretely, face to face, in all kinds of walks of life, and those are smoothly and complexly integrated a lot of times into your other information technologies and how you use those. For example, I prefer to do my grocery shopping face to face. So I will go into a grocery store, buy the thing, say hi to people that I know who always go there, say hi to the people who work there whom I know, and so on. And that for me is part of the way I have a community. My wife, on the other hand, prefers to order her stuff online and either have it delivered or go and pick it up, and her interactions are really minimal. Those are two types of networks. It's not that one is right and the other one is wrong. It's that they have different effects and create community in specifically different ways, right? These are the kinds of network choices that we're in the process of making. And now we can create a very important and interesting update to our concept of ethology, which we haven't talked about for a little while. Ethology is in the background of all of our experiences of identity. And part of the reason for that is that it's our interested perception in the world. But we are also in a networked relationship, an ecological set of relations with other people and other things and other technologies that share our connections with other people and other things. And this network is much more expanded under our current conditions, and it changes the environment in which we live and therefore changes the way we perceive. Right? You've noticed perhaps, and I certainly have as an educator, that there is a prevalence of conspiracy theories floating around these days. Conspiracy theories are always bad thought for a couple of reasons that I can very quickly outline here. One is that they do not subject their theories to falsifiability, to the proof that somebody else could demonstrate. Right? They hide in the shadows, and they use something called confirmation bias, right? Where you find evidence that supports the theory, but you ignore all the things, and there are many things that always contradict conspiracy. So the reason that these conspiracy theories have flooded into our culture is because certain networks are now interconnected that didn't used to be, right? Channels and websites that really previously had a very small following are now networked into larger communities, and we're sharing ideas much more. But also, like I said before, our very notion of what story we're telling is a little bit discombobulated now. So that makes us very vulnerable to that kind of disinformation. Right? This all goes contrary to the Platonic concept of nationhood, the notion that we actually have a kind of a spiritual or essential connection with one another. Hegel was the great theorist, the great Platonic theorist of nationhood, and he called this Geist, which is the German word for spirit. So spirit, as you'll recall, is another stand-in for the term essence, right? So when we talk about, for example, our soul or our psyche, we're using more stand-ins for that notion of essence. Being a consistent, coherent entity over time is what we're always looking for in that Platonic structure. You'll recall that Hegel's theory of dialectic is something that he consistently applied to all of his philosophical theories, and his notion is that when one nation comes into conflict with another, it actually actually self-realizes. But I started this chapter with a contrary example, didn't I? In World War I, what we actually came out of that war feeling was that we didn't want nationhood anymore. In fact, there was a huge drive to establish what was called the League of Nations, which was the first version, if you will, the 1.0 of what becomes the United Nations. And yet we know still, nonetheless, despite that those drives really in a lot of ways had fruition in these new organizations, that we still feel that a nation is our primary structural form of identity in that process. So Hegel thought that as we encountered these different nations and worked with them or against them, that just like an individual working with wood, we'd find out more who we were and we would express ourselves more broadly. And this is important especially for Germany, which had imperial designs for quite a while. They wanted to go to war with places like France, like Russia, like England, and by those wars to really self-realize, right? And so it seemed to actually fit, especially in the 19th century when Hegel was writing. It was a period of war. And we might think of that as a process of the creation of the autobiography of a nation, right? The construction of a narrative of national destiny. What's interesting to notice again is that in the 20th century, however, even if we don't accept Benedict Anderson's, I think, very convincing theory of imagined communities, we can simply see that Hegel's theory of Geist has actually somewhat just fallen apart all by itself. Think about this. In the United States, we've had a concept of national destiny for quite a while. It has changed over time. The national destiny at first was the imagination of the concept of democracy. Then it became the spread of democracy to different groups. Then it became the concept of manifest destiny, which had imperial elements, spreading the United States borders all the way from coast to coast, taking over that territory, which did involve us in some key wars, most notably the Mexican-American War. But today, even though we've recently, at least in recent memory, had some national feeling of national destiny, for example, think about the moonwalk, right, sending a man to the moon, or defeating communism. Those could also be 20th century models of national destiny. What we found today actually is that we don't have a strong sense of national destiny, and at least part of that is because we've started to see what the costs are of Platonic identity. I want to use as an example of, for talking about these problems, one of the most famous Hollywood films of all time, but also one of the most terrible expressions of racism that we've ever had from a Hollywood studio, The Birth of Nations by the masterful D.W. Griffiths. Now, I have to talk about this in two different ways, and I have a video here that you can watch that also helps you through talking about this movie in two different ways. On the one hand, D.W. Griffiths' The Birth of the Nation is a foundational Hollywood film. It establishes many of the concepts of artistic technique and representation that then become normal in Hollywood studios. Not for any nefarious reason, but that Griffiths was actually simply a master of the art. Unfortunately, in addition to that, he also used that masterful artistry to depict something that we no longer agree with at all. Although it is worth noting that The Birth of a Nation was an extremely popular film when it came out in the 19-teens, right around World War I, because that was a period of time in which the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, was actually in the ascendant, and they were dominating many aspects of culture at that time. Along with the emergence of the KKK during this time, we had a huge rise in lynchings, hate crimes that involved murder, almost always of black people. Usually of black men. These are murders without a trial, but even more shockingly, when these lynchings happened, they were treated a lot of times as social events. Families would go out and bring a picnic and bring their children. They would have bonfires and dance and play music around this dead body who had been murdered for no reason other than the fact that they had the wrong color skin. And people, I'm not making any of this up, by the way. I invite you to check this out if it horrifies you into disbelief. It really is part of our American history here. A lot of times the body would then be burned, and different charred parts of that body would then be cut off and sold or given away to people who came to the event as a souvenir. Right? This level of dehumanization is absolutely incredible for us to think about today, and it's a big part of why The Birth of the Nation is not something that's often discussed, even in film classes, although it should be for both of those reasons. One is that it's a masterful film that introduces many film techniques we still use. Also, it's a reminder of our past. And it's unfortunately fairly honest, right? So the concept of The Birth of a Nation is that we are achieving our national destiny by achieving a white-dominated society. Well, that's something that we no longer agree with, although I would say if you look at, for example, the recent march in Charlottesville and other events, that in fact that narrative or that argument about narrative is still going on with us culturally today and maybe here for a while to come. Think about that movie and what it's proposing as a form of national destiny in contrast to a wonderful book that's really quite remarkable that also has been made into 2 television series. One fairly recently. I'm not sure who made it. I want to say maybe AMC in the second version. But the original version I know was on PBS, and I watched that as a kid. But as I grew up, I read the book as well, and I highly recommend reading this. It's another great read for summer. It's a compelling story by Alex Haley, and what he does is investigate his own past from the capture of his ancestors in Africa all the way into the background for his own life. And as he tells this story, part of it is built on research, right? So he's researching and discovering some of this. Some of it he's narrating and making up, right? He's narrativizing and fictionalizing as well to fill in these gaps. It's a very compelling story, but what it deals with is not a story of national destiny. This is not an autobiography in the classic sense. This is actually an anti-autobiography in the sense that what he's really talking about is the experience of loss and trauma, right? So rather than the image of coherence and realizing who he is, this exploration of roots is about loss and difference, right? And this is something that we talked about way back in the W.E.B. Du Bois section on the discussion of race, the psychological trauma of being a split identity, not being able to realize yourself in a way that's culturally acceptable, leads to these gaps or absences, that veil experience that Du Bois discussed. Here, roots is another exploration of that, but it gives us a chronological development of that and shows that this trauma is actually very much integral to our form of identity. In order to understand the way that trauma relates to identity, which is a very anti-Platonic way of thinking about identity, right, we need to turn again to psychoanalysis. You'll recall that for Sigmund Freud, contradiction is inherent in selfhood. And what that means is that when we develop memories, we are always in the process of creating difference from ourselves. Okay, so what does that mean? He had a wonderful metaphor, Freud did, for discussing the way that trauma occurs in our mind. He used the image of the magic writing pad. If you've ever messed with one of these, and I played with one of these as a kid, so it's like physiologically ingrained in my memory that when you press on a little wax paper under that sits on top of a wax pad, you make a dark mark and you can actually draw on there, right? Not with a pen, but with something called a stylus, this blue thing right here. And then after you had drawn a little bit and done whatever you want, doodled, you can lift up the wax paper from the wax pad underneath, and magically all the things that you had written there or drawn there disappear, and it's a fresh slate for you to write on again. A fancier version of this today, of course, is the Etch-a-Sketch, but I actually like the original metaphor because it works better with what Freud is looking at. So he says, think of your memory as like a magic writing pad. You experience a ton of stuff every day scribbled on that top of that magic writing pad. And then at the end of the day, you kind of get rid of it all, don't you? Right? You go to sleep, you get into a different context, you forget from a little bit of time or a change of situation, etc. But if you were to take that stylus and press really hard into that magic writing pad, even after you lifted up that wax paper, you'd still be able to see marks and indentations on the original underlying wax, wouldn't you? Right? Because that's malleable, permeable too. But what would happen if you then, after that, put down the wax paper again on top? Well, you wouldn't be able to see anything. The marks would still be there, but they'd be underneath. And he says that's what trauma is. Trauma is that experience that indelibly mark something into your brain, but doesn't necessarily therefore become accessible to you at an everyday level. It's there deeply buried, and you can uncover it, but only at the risk of exploring your own self-difference. All right. If you pretend that you are a coherent identity and that you have none of these psychological contradictions, which I think it's very tempting for us to try to do that sometimes, right? But what we're doing, Freud would argue thereby, is ignoring all of those previous experiences, many of which happened in childhood and times that were long gone for us once we reach adulthood, which nonetheless are still there. Why does that matter? Because when they're there for us but not for our consciousness, they're available to other parts of our mind, specifically for Freud, the subconscious and the unconscious. And those two elements therefore influence us. So the key psychological theory that Freud develops that we still work on today is that past traumas actually guide our experience and behavior today. If you ever do something that doesn't make sense to you, or you repeat a pattern that's self-destructive in some way, from a psychoanalytic point of view, there's a really understandable reason for that. It's that you have past traumas that actually guide you in those behaviors, but without you on the surface of that magic writing pad, so to speak, on the surface of your day-to-day life, you being aware that those deep indentations are lying just below the surface. Freud called this a palimpsest. He said that our experiential memory is like a palimpsest, which is a technical word of something that's written over and over again on top of, right? So it makes a mess. Here's an example right here. And a lot of times in painting, because a canvas was a very rare item until fairly recently in world history, a painter who needed to paint a new painting would simply paint over something that they'd done before. Well, if you do that enough times, then you end up with a palimpsest, don't you? And one of the things that's quite amazing that art historians do when they get a canvas that's new or that they don't know about is they'll X-ray, and by X-raying they actually can see all the layers down below, and it's happened more than once that in fact they've discovered a painting by a very famous painter underneath a painting that actually was by somebody less famous. So in other words, they discovered a painting, so to speak, but in this structure of the palimpsest, where one is layered on top of the other, on top of the other. So we have those secret histories, just like the painters discovered with the canvas. We have those secret histories in ourselves, right? We have those ways of seeing and experiencing the world that in some ways are outside of or different from our current subjectivity. What Alex Haley explores in the book Roots, and then the television dramas Roots, is that it is part of us, right? That trauma is part of us. Even if it's not available to us at any given moment, it can still shape us. And so the reason I say this is an anti-autobiography, or contrary to that Platonic teleological movement towards identity, is that if these things are there and influencing us but missing from us, what we start to see is that our identity is not structured by the positive movement of self-realization. It's at least partially discovered under this process of trauma and loss. And that's not unique to Alex Haley. That's something that in some way or another we all experience. One of the ways that we've talked about this trauma, this cultural trauma at a larger than individual level, is in the field of what's called post-colonialism, first introduced by a wonderful thinker named Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon came from Martinique, and Martinique was a former French colony. You'll recall from our chapter on race that we discussed how colonization worked. There was a system of economics called mercantile capitalism that demanded that monocropping raw resources then sent those raw resources to the motherland, in this case France, and the people who were brought over to work those colonies were treated terribly as second-class citizens at the best. After the end of colonization, right? France and England and other nations continued to hold on to and in many ways influence their former colonies, but they were also undergoing an important change known as post-colonialism. Frantz Fanon was one of the first theorists to really name and write about this concept, and he did it from a first-person experience. As a subject in Martinique, he was both a French subject and not a full French subject. And he was a very talented or gifted academic. And so he was invited to go to the primary university in Paris to finish his doctoral work in psychoanalysis, which he went and did. So he moved to Paris from Martinique And while he was living there, he explored something very close to what W.E.B. Du Bois would call double consciousness. So he was aware of the fact that he was both a French citizen and never accepted quite as a French citizen. I have a video here that talks through this and gives a straightforward everyday example of this experience, but the end result of this set of double standards, or the double consciousness that's built into those cultural contradictions, is to create what's called a subaltern, somebody who is both of a culture but secondary to that culture. One of the most famous explorations of this in post-colonial theory, which is a full-fledged academic area of study, is the relationship between England and India. So England colonized India, changed its values, changed its language, changed its form of government, and ruled over India and its subaltern subjects for a long time. Now India is a sovereign nation with its own democracy, and yet it still feels very strongly the traumatic history of England, right? And those effects are things that we can explore and talk about in various ways, but they ultimately assimilate to this concept of hegemony, right? Which cultures dominate, which notions of subjectivity become normal, which ones, by contrast, are considered abnormal or subnormal in a subaltern condition. So hegemony, we can summarize as the cultural norms that shapes our assumptions and values. We have many hegemonic elements in our culture, and it's important to recognize that this is not coming from a conspiratorial position. When we decide what we want culturally, it has to do with a complex and shifting set of influences. Think about, for example, in music, hegemonically, in the early 20th century, the kind of classical music that Theodor Adorno preferred would have been the hegemonic norm. It would have been what was played on all of the radio stations, and it would have been the music that would have been played in the symphony halls, which would have been the major place to experience live music. Obviously, throughout the 20th century, that's changed dramatically, and not because a group of people got together and decided to change it. It was simply through this process of the development of what we call popular culture. And in fact, you can't predict what kind of music is going to be popular 10 years from now, partly because we simply don't have control over hegemony. Nonetheless, it's a really useful handle on the way that cultural dominance can become powerful and overwhelming, in fact, to certain forms of subjectivity. Because unlike music, which is more or less considered a free choice for us today, when you have certain cultural norms that are enforced and reinforced culturally, sometimes with brutal effects, then what you see actually is that people, although they may accept those hegemonic norms, they develop that double consciousness that both Frantz Fanon and Du Bois were so concerned about. I like to think about hegemony and the everyday effects and how it shapes so many of the things that we do. For example, do men and women tend to talk about different things, right? Why do men tend to talk about things like sports or technology, and women tend to talk about social things or clothing? And of course, here I'm stereotyping. I do understand that. But in those binary formations, we see hegemony actually at work. Whenever I go to a party with my wife, I always gravitate towards all of her friends because for me, the women are having the more fun conversation. That's where the gossip is. That's where the jokes are that I find funny. And I have to confess that I find endless conversations about sports and cars pretty boring. So those are choices that I get to make contrary to gender norms. And yet within that framework, that hegemony is fully in place, right? How gender shapes our assumptions about the world. Think again about hegemony in the Louvre Museum, where literally the quote-unquote important art is in the top 3 floors in this beautiful, well-lit area, whereas the artifacts are put down at the bottom, literally in these dark basements that become a metaphor for the way that we value or devalue these different aspects. So hegemony can have cultural effects that are quite far-reaching. Within the framework of colonialism, that hegemony itself was tied into race and racism very strongly. In fact, one of the most frequently associated terms with colonialism is white man's burden, the notion that white Europeans had a duty, in fact, to colonize the rest of the world, the darker countries they were called, and to control them thereby. What went unsaid, of course, is that there were some tremendous economic advantages that these white nations were taking on, as well as this supposed burden. But the idea was that Europeans were cultured and that everybody else was barbarous so they were barbarians, right? But instead of simply rejecting or ignoring them, the story goes, the white man's burden created the duty to assimilate all of these other people through their differences. As they get rid of those differences like dross, they're supposed to assimilate to that normative hegemonic culture. In the United States, what that hegemonic culture is something that has shifted and changed quite a bit, but by and large, it has still been dominated by our binary structures of race, class, gender, and sexuality. So the underlying assumption behind these notions of nationhood and colonization and hegemony are the Platonic structures of thought, the notion that eidos forms separate entities that have essences, and those essences can never change, right? But remember, I've been proposing more and more the notion of hybridity as a contrasting and more useful and functional description of the reality that we live in. And so when we think about our culture, I think it's worth asking whether or not we truly are separate from other cultures, and if so, in what ways. And I want to give you a really big historical example of one of the ways in which we truly are a hybrid culture, which is the Islamic Golden Age. After the emergence of Mohammedanism and Islam, there was a huge efflorescence of culture and science in the Islamic countries. And these countries expanded all the way into northern Africa and, in fact, what we today call Spain, which was controlled by the Umayyad Caliphate, so an Islamic area. And in that Umayyad Caliphate, there was a tremendous amount of cultural and personal diversity. You could celebrate any religion that you wanted to during the Islamic Golden Age. You were taxed for celebrating different religions than Islam, but it was perfectly capable for you to have a highly successful career and be an important member of the community while not being Muslim. What that led to was a tremendous amount of cultural exchange and interchange. And in this Islamic Golden Age, it was actually the Middle East and North Africa that created many of the scientific and mathematical discoveries that we now think of as belonging to the West. So if we say, for example, Western medicine, we're really not using the right term, because our concepts of math and science actually come from non-Western, Eastern places that are supposed to be the Orient, right? The difference from our location in space. But in fact, when we think about, for example, the development of chemistry, the word for that originally was alchemia. Chemistry actually does not exist in Europe. It's introduced from the Middle East. Think about many of our key forms of mathematics, most famously algebra, and even the term algorithm, which is an important term for us today, which originally just generically meant mathematics, now of course is in many of our discussions about computers and the way that we develop computer software. These developments changed the way that we had concepts of, for example, medicine, and also, and very importantly, it was a place that was interested in all forms of philosophy, including Greek and Roman philosophy. Now, meanwhile, what had happened in Western Europe is that it had undergone a really powerful conversion to Christianity during the medieval period, in which many of these values about science, math, medicine, and philosophy had been lost. The values and the ways that they were studied really circulated around our concept of theology, right? What God understood to be the truth, and how it was communicated to us through the Bible, right? So there was a singular source of information, the Bible, and the only place where other information that might contrast to the Bible was kept were in monastic libraries. So the various monasteries would keep a few books. Many of them were destroyed over time through fire, or literally through bookworms, right, which are little creatures that like to eat paper. So in the West, the so-called Western society, we were in the process of losing all of that heritage from Greece and Rome that I've been talking about, but it was actually in the so-called Orient, or the Middle East, and in North Africa, places that we think of as very different from Western Europe and the Western cultural heritage. That was actually where these things were being developed. The Library of Baghdad replaced the Library of Alexandria after the Library of Alexandria burned down. You'll recall that I mentioned the Library of Alexandria when I was talking about Porphyry and the development of our concepts of intertextuality. Well, the Library of Alexandria, after it burned, created a vacuum, a cultural vacuum, in which many of these texts, but also many of the scholars who worked in that area, were lost or moved to another place. The Library of Baghdad, which is situated in modern-day Iraq, actually became that cultural center again, but it wasn't a Western cultural center. It was tied to the Islamic Golden Age. If you'd like to know more about this, I've included a video, since I recognize that for many of you this information would probably be brand new. If you'd like to know even more about that, feel free to take my world history class, in which we dig very deep into the Christian medieval period in Europe, and also into the Islamic Golden Age, and the way that the two interacted and created what we now call the Renaissance, which literally means the rebirth of culture. It's an interesting term, the rebirth, right? Because it assumes that all along Western Europe was the same culture and it simply was born again. And yet, in fact, what we see is that we have a hybridized culture full of different influences from different people, from different areas, right? So now that we've really introduced this notion of hybridity and used it to contrast the notion of a coherent teleological identity, let's actually look at it. I'm taking this term specifically from a wonderful theorist named Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston actually is a fiction writer, so perhaps you know her from her best novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and if you've never read that, you should read it. She was also a really good anthropologist, and she studied with a Harvard anthropologist named Franz Boas, who was in the process of developing theories that went contrary to Plato in the early 20th century. As Boas's student, Zora Neale Hurston was a shining example of what you can do with the concepts of hybridity, and in fact, she really used those to develop this notion in a series of studies, anthropological studies that she did on the language and language use of Southern African Americans. So she would go into a culture in the southern region, specifically black communities, listen to the language, talk with them, and do the recordings, all the things that an anthropologist typically would do, but with the larger goal of expressing the meanings that were going on along racial lines of identity and the way different or parallel cultures were being developed in the United States that she would characterize as hybrid. What does she mean by hybrid? Well, she noticed that many aspects of white European culture were contrary to many aspects of the African American culture that she was seeing, but it's not as though they were binarily opposite. For example, one of the things that she was intrigued by is the way that Western concepts of art and culture were often taken on but transformed in a hybrid mode within African American culture. Think about, for example, the way that a jazz player like Charlie Parker would take a saxophone and use it in an entirely different way than it had been used in orchestral music. That changed things forever. Or think about, again, the way that a poet like Langston Hughes, a contemporary of Zora Neale Hurston, would take the sonnet style of Shakespeare but transform it using the rhythms of blues that he was hearing in his New York apartment, and use those concepts to create new forms of poetry that had never been created before. Think about, again, the separation originally of the so-called Negro League from professional baseball, which was only broken in the early 1960s by Jackie Robinson. What's interesting, though, is that Jackie Robinson actually had already had a full career in the Negro League, and that was where he learned to play baseball in his specific style. Most importantly, his base running style, which nobody in the major leagues, which was white dominated at that time, had ever seen before. Now, of course, if you watch baseball or basketball or any of the other professional or most of the other professional sports, you see a tremendous diversity of people there playing all together. That's because they're bringing different styles, different notions of how to play into this hybrid mix, and we've seen that we like it and that it improves the game and the experience, just like poetry was improved with hybridity and music was improved with hybridity. Think about Jimi Hendrix, right, who took the guitar and showed that you could do brand new things with it, right? The guitar is an interesting example of a hybrid instrument all by itself. It originated in Africa, but became popular through the Umayyad Caliphate in Europe from Spain. If you actually, still today, if you go to Spain, the most popular instrument by far is the guitar. And then eventually in the 20th century, it was electrified, right? So brought into this technological structure of American culture, and then it was taken up by this young black man who wanted to do something radically different with it, and who in fact, for all intents and purposes, really reinvented what you can do with the guitar. If you've never heard the music of Jimi Hendrix, you haven't lived, but you should also check it out. It's worth knowing about, and if you listen to it long enough, you'll hear styles of play that are still used to this day. Here's somebody you probably do know all about, Michael Jackson, right, who took pop music and really changed it in a hybrid format. And here's somebody you probably know about as well, Biggie Smalls, who again took many of the styles of music from the 1960s and 70s and reincorporated them into what's called gangster rap. What he's doing here, or what any of these artists are doing, is always this formation of hybridity that Zora Neale Hurston was originally so interested in. Not a rejection of one culture over another, not a hegemonic domination of one culture by another, but an intermixing which is complex and messy and ends up making us reflect on our very roots and origins. It brings us, in fact, back to Heraclitus, doesn't it? Right? The flux of life, the way the differences are the things that actually make a difference. Perhaps no theorist has thought about this more fully than the Harvard theorist and post-colonial author, Homi K. Bhabha. And here I want to take a close look at a rather long passage from a very important collection of essays that he wrote in the mid-1990s that summarize in many ways the problems and the promises of the concept of hybridity. Now I'm going to read this, and I want you to keep in mind again that there is a class or cultural concept going on here. He's writing in an academic style, so some of this will be hard to follow, right? Some of the styles of writing and thinking that he's engaged in do make assumptions about what kind of person you are. However, in a hybrid style, what I'd really invite you to do is learn how to develop the literacy to understand these conversations so that you yourself can get in there and change them so that they work for you, right? If this stuff feels foreign and strange, just remember a lot of power travels through this language, and it travels through academia. And if you want to influence that, you have to start by really understanding it. So here comes that experience yet again in this class. He writes, "The effect of mimicry on authority of colonial discourse is profound and disturbing. For in normalizing the colonial state or subject, the dream of post-enlightenment civility alienates its own language of liberty and produces another knowledge of its norms. It is from this area between mimicry and mockery where the reforming, civilizing mission is threatened by the displacing gaze of its disciplinary double that my instances of colonial imitation come. What they all share is a discursive process by which the excess or slippage produced by the ambivalence of mimicry, almost the same, but not quite, does not merely rupture the discourse, but becomes transformed into an uncertainty which fixes the colonial subject as a partial presence." So remember, he's talking about the subaltern here, right? The idea that we already introduced from Frantz Fanon. But what he's really showing is that when Frantz Fanon or someone like him came to Paris, what his very existence was doing was showing up a certain contradiction or problem within the colonial process, right? Because on the one hand, the colonial structure normalized the state or the subject. It had a normal idea of who the right person was supposed to be. On the other hand, through the very process of colonization, it actually challenged the notion of civility and the concepts of liberty that are supposed to be promoted by these nations, right? So France is a democracy. Everybody's supposed to be equal in that democracy. And yet the very fact of the existence of colonization shows that that was in contradiction, right? And so Homi K. Bhabha's interest is in the fact that a subaltern already just by existing right there shows up a key contradiction within the framework of our narrative about who we are and how we interact with others. And he says that it's in this area between mimicry and mockery. So Frantz Fanon was both French, but not French, right? He was both a guy living in Paris studying at the Sorbonne and a colonial subject from Martinique, where the reforming and civilizing mission is threatened by the displacing gaze of its disciplinary double. When Frantz Fanon stopped and looked out at these French people, he was aware, through that process of double consciousness, of those contradictions. He couldn't be any other thing than aware of that contradiction because he was living it right there, Homike Baba would argue. So what all of these experiences have in common is a discursive process by which the excess or slippage, right, the things that do not fit in those cultural norms of France towards Frantz Fanon, produced by the ambivalence of mimicry, almost but not quite. So, right, Frantz Fanon is almost a good college student, almost a normal Frenchman, but not quite, right? Does not merely rupture the discourse, the ideas of liberty and equality that we have, but becomes transformed into an uncertainty which fixed the colonial subject as a partial presence, right? So Frantz Fanon will always be there. He'll always be there to remind French people of these contradictions. Whether or not they want to realize those, that rupture has already been created in the discourse. Right? There's an incoherence, a contradiction, right? And here, for this framing, we can think back to Sigmund Freud, right? Contradiction is inherent not only in selfhood, but also in nationhood and the way we formulate those nations. So I hope by going through part by part of this very complex paragraph, I've been able to unpack what's really rich and important about what he's saying. I also have a much easier example to get into with one of my favorite writers and thinkers, Eddie Huang. So Eddie Huang is a really interesting guy. He wrote an autobiography that was an anti-autobiography called Fresh Off the Boat that then was turned into a television program, which you may have seen. You can certainly check it out. It's a sitcom. And Eddie Huang's story, his personal story, is quite a bit different than this, right? What it does is really explore different formations of identity as somebody who is both Taiwanese and American and trying to find his way through different constructions of identity from that formation. So, for example, he studies law for a while. He actually almost becomes a lawyer, but then he changes his mind completely. And before you know it, in a few pages more, he's selling sneakers in New York, right? How you get between those different positions and then eventually landing where he mostly formulates his identity today, which is a food entrepreneur and somebody who writes for Vice magazine. So a journalist, how he comes to these hybrid formations of identity is the purpose of writing Fresh Off the Boat. And what he's really playing with here is the notion that an immigrant is not somebody who necessarily has to assimilate to a cultural norm, but rather somebody who challenges those norms by exploring them. So very much within Homike Baba's formation of the academic problem of post-colonialism. I have a video here that I highly recommend that you watch from his Vice series called Munchies. In this one, all of them are interesting, but in this one in particular, he goes to England, London, and he looks at the cultural tensions between Pakistan and India, which formerly were one country, but both of those in relation to England and English culture. And he talks precisely about what Homike Baba is doing. So please watch that, enjoy it. Remember, his style is very salty. He's specifically not talking in an academic form. And remember that that's a strategy that he's using. So enjoy this, and I will see you next time.